The wind howled like starving wolves as Aaron fought to stay upright on his rough wooden raft. Snow fell so thick he could barely see his own calloused hands. Below a towering pine, he spotted something that would change everything. The orc female Thalira and her cub surrendered to death. Aaron had been a frontier scout for 11 years. He knew the northern marks better than he knew his own reflection. Every frozen creek, every hidden path between Millbrook and the iron borders. He was a man built for solitude, with shoulders wide as a barn door and hands that could split firewood all morning without complaint. People called him reliable. What they meant was stubborn. That afternoon, his stubbornness nearly killed him. The clouds above the iron peaks had been wrong since morning. Too black, too low, moving too fast. Any wise man would have turned back. Aaron had looked at those clouds, looked at his loaded mule, and decided the provisions bound for the frontier garrison were more important than a little weather. He had made that trip 40 times. He knew every rock. What he did not know was that the worst blizzard in 30 years was about to swallow him whole. The snow came without warning, the way real danger always does. One moment he could see the road ahead, the next, he was walking through white nothing. The temperature dropped so fast he felt it in his teeth. His mule, a stubborn beast named Rust, pressed close against his leg and refused to move faster than a slow walk. Aaron could not blame her. Each step felt like pushing through wet sand. He pulled his bearskin coat tighter and kept moving north, counting his paces. That was the trick his old commander had taught him. When you cannot see, you count. 1, 2, 3. You count, and you trust your legs to remember the road even when your eyes are useless. By pace 400, he knew he was in trouble. The cold had moved past uncomfortable and into something else, something that felt almost calm, which was the worst sign of all. A man who stops shivering in the snow is a man who is starting to die without knowing it. Aaron forced himself to breathe hard, to keep the blood moving, to feel the burn in his lungs. He pushed through a wall of snow-heavy branches into a small clearing. Rust stopped dead. The animal's ears went straight up. She made a low sound in her chest that Aaron had only heard her make once before. The time they had crossed a ridge and surprised a wounded bear. It was not fear exactly. It was recognition of something alive and wrong. Aaron wiped the snow from his eyes and squinted into the white. 30 paces ahead, under the massive spreading arms of an ancient pine, he saw 2 shapes of green against the snow. The color was unmistakable. The deep, vivid green of orc skin, the kind that looked almost too bright to be real, like something the forest itself had grown. He took 1 step forward, then stopped. His hand moved toward the iron pistol at his hip without him deciding to move it. Years of frontier life had trained his body to respond to orcs before his mind could weigh the options. He had seen orc raiders burn 3 settlements along the iron borders. He had buried men with orc axe marks on their bones. But then the wind shifted, and he heard it. Not a war cry, not a threat. A child crying. The sound was faint and weak, like a candle flame in a storm, small and desperate and entirely without malice. Aaron's hand fell away from the pistol. He stood in the snow, listening to that tiny sound, and felt something old and stubborn inside him loosen, just slightly, like a knot that had been tied too long beginning at last to give. He did not know it yet, but that moment, that loosening, was the end of one life and the beginning of another. Aaron moved forward slowly, keeping his hands visible. The 2 shapes under the pine resolved into clear detail as he closed the distance. The female was sitting with her back against the bark, her legs pulled up beneath her. She was tall, even seated. He could tell she had height on most men he knew. Her skin was the bright green of spring leaves, and her pointed ears were pressed flat against her skull, a sign he knew from the frontier meant pain or exhaustion rather than aggression. Small, discreet tusks curved up from her lower jaw. Her leather clothing, decorated with small bone beads and a strip of dark crystal along the collar, was soaked through and beginning to freeze in the creases. She held a child against her chest. The child, a small male, maybe 3 years old, had his face buried in his mother's neck. He was the one making the sound. It was not a cry anymore exactly. It was quieter than that, more like something escaping him without his permission. The female's eyes found Eren. They were dark, nearly black, and they were afraid. Not the afraid of someone about to attack, the afraid of someone who had already run out of options and knew it. Her lips had gone grey-blue around the edges. Her breathing was shallow and wrong. She looked at his hand, at his weapons, at his face. And she did not move. Not because she was being calm, but because she no longer had the strength to run. Eren stopped 6 paces away. He had seen this before. Not with orcs. He had never been this close to a living orc female, not off a battlefield, but he had seen it with settlers caught in early winter storms. He had seen what the cold did when it got deep enough. He had seen men with that same grey colour around their mouths. Most of them had not made it. He unslung his pack slowly, keeping his movements easy and visible. The female watched him with those dark eyes and did not move. The child stirred and turned his head slightly, and Eren caught a glimpse of a small face with wide, frightened eyes and the faintest shadow of tusks not yet grown. The boy's skin had lost some of its colour. His small hands were curled against his chest like fallen leaves. Eren crouched down in the snow. He pulled out the heavy bearskin he kept rolled at the bottom of his pack. The emergency fur he carried precisely because the northern marks could kill a man between 1 hour and the next. He held it out with both hands, keeping his eyes steady and his posture low, non-threatening, like approaching a spooked horse. The female looked at the fur, looked at him, looked at the fur again. He could see her deciding. Could see her weighing everything. All the war, all the blood, all the old reasons why a human with weapons was the last thing she should trust. He could see the weight of it in her face. And he could see, underneath that weight, the small still fact that her child was dying. She let him approach. He wrapped the fur around the boy first. The child made a sound when the warmth hit him. Not quite a word, not quite a cry. Something in between. Eren tucked the edges in carefully, his calloused hands moving with a gentleness that surprised even him. Then he stood and held out his hand to the female. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it. Her grip was strong even now. Even half frozen, he felt the cold radiating off her palm like something physical. He set his arm against her side and took her weight, and they began moving, slowly, through the white, toward the dark outline of a place he remembered from a summer scouting run 3 years ago. A shelter. Barely. But enough. Rust followed without being told, pressing close on their other side, sharing her animal warmth without being asked. Before they reached the door, the female touched her own chest with her free hand and said, with great effort, "Thalira." Then she pointed to the boy bundled against Rust's flank. "Throne!" Eren steadied her against the doorframe and touched his own chest. "Eren," he said. She held his eyes for 1 moment. Then they went inside. The shelter was a trapper's cabin, abandoned years ago and listing badly to one side. One wall had partially collapsed under old snow weight, leaving a gap that the wind found immediately. The door hung from a single hinge and groaned when Eren shouldered it open. He had stayed in worse places. He got Thalira through the door first, guiding her toward the driest corner, a spot near the collapsed wall where at least 3 solid walls still stood, and the floor was covered in old pine needles rather than bare mud. He set her down with her back to the corner and placed the child in her arms. The boy was not crying anymore. He had gone quiet in the way that worried Eren more than the crying had. The cabin was dark and smelled of rot and old wood and something animal from long ago. The cold inside was only slightly less than the cold outside, but slightly was enough to matter. Aaron moved to the rusted iron stove in the center of the room. It was still standing. He checked the flue with his fingers, blocked with debris but not collapsed. He pulled a handful of dead pine needles from the floor, found a fragment of dry wood under the fallen wall section, and went to work with his flint and steel. His fingers were almost too stiff to make sparks. He tried 3 times. 4. On the 5th strike, a spark caught, and he bent down close and breathed on it with the slow, careful breath of a man who had done this exact thing 100 times. The orange thread of fire moved into the wood and held. He fed it small pieces, then larger ones. When the stove was going strong, he stood and looked at the female. She was watching the fire with an expression he could not quite read, something between disbelief and a grief so old it had stopped being sharp. The child in her arms had begun to stir. The warmth was reaching them. Aaron took stock of the cabin. The collapsed wall section was the biggest problem. The wind was coming straight through. He found a section of old canvas in the corner, probably left by the trapper years ago, stiff with age and mildew, but still whole. He dragged it over and wedged it into the gap, weighting the bottom edge with stones from the broken stove surround. It was not perfect, but it cut the wind. He pulled the rest of his supplies from his pack, a small amount of dried beef, hard bread 3 days old, a tin cup, a small pouch of ground grain for porridge. He inventoried everything without expression, the way a man does when he's deciding how to make enough out of not enough. Then he looked at the female again. She was still watching him. The fear had not left her eyes entirely, but it had moved back, making room for something more complicated. He was a human with weapons who had not used them. He had given warmth to her child before he had given it to himself. He had fixed the wall before he had eaten anything. She did not know what to do with that. He crossed the cabin and sat down a few feet from her, close enough to share the stove's heat, far enough to give her space. He pulled out the dried beef and broke it in half without a word, holding one piece toward her. She looked at it. He waited. The child reached out from inside the fur and grabbed the edge of the dried meat with one tiny green hand. Thalira made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, and took the food. They ate in silence while the stove crackled and the wind beat against the canvas and failed to get through. Outside, the blizzard redoubled itself against the dark. Inside, 3 lives that had no reason to be together sat around a small fire and, for the first time, breathed without fear. The night was the hardest part. Aaron kept the stove fed, rising every hour to add wood. The cabin's floor was uneven, and the cold crept through the boards despite the fire. He spread Rust's saddle blanket on the cleanest section of floor and motioned for Thalira to move the child there, closer to the stove's heat. She moved carefully, still watching him the way wild things watch, tracking every motion. He respected that. He would have done the same. The boy had warmed through completely by midnight. He curled on the blanket with the bearskin pulled up to his chin, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Aaron watched that rhythm for a long time before he felt his own chest unclench. Thalira sat beside the child, her back straight despite exhaustion, refusing to sleep while a human was in the room. He understood. He pulled his own back to the opposite wall, crossed his arms, and closed his eyes without actually sleeping. The half-rest of a frontier scout, body still, senses still running. Sometime in the early hours, he opened his eyes and found her watching him. He nodded. She looked away. By morning, the blizzard had not stopped. If anything, it was worse. Aaron checked the snow depth through the gap in the canvas, knee-deep and still coming down, with a wind that would strip the skin from your face in minutes, going nowhere today. He made a thin porridge from the grain pouch and melted snow, dividing it into 3 portions. He had no bowls, so he used the tin cup for the child and the pan's lid for Thalira, and cupped his own portion in his hands and drank it standing up while they ate. It was barely food, but it was warm. Thrawn woke fully that morning. He sat up, looked at Eren with enormous dark eyes, and then looked at his mother. She said something quiet and guttural, and he relaxed slightly. Not all the way, but enough to look around the cabin with the specific curiosity of a small child who cannot help being interested in things even when he should be frightened. His eyes found the pack hanging from a nail on the wall, then found the pistol on Eren's hip, then found the small carved knife at his belt, a decorative piece, old, with a handle made of deer antler. He pointed at the knife. Eren unhooked it slowly and held it out, handle first. The boy looked at his mother. She studied Eren's face for a moment, then gave a small, cautious nod. The boy reached out and took the knife with both hands, turning it over with the intense focus children bring to objects they find beautiful. It was the first ordinary moment they had shared, just a child looking at a pretty knife in firelight. Eren reached into the bottom of his pack and found what he was looking for. A palm-sized piece of pine he had picked up without thinking on the trail, the habit of a man who always had something to do with his hands. He took out his small carpentry blade and began to cut. He was not sure yet what it would be. He let the wood decide. The boy watched him carve. By the time the light through the canvas gap had changed from grey to the pale gold of afternoon, Eren had roughed out two shapes, a horse and a wolf, one in each hand, the animals of both their worlds. Simple, barely more than the idea of each one, but recognizable. He held them out, one in each palm. Thrawn took them both with both hands, turned them over, pressed his thumb against the carved mane of the horse, then the arched back of the wolf. Then looked up at Eren with an expression of such uncomplicated delight that the scout had to look away for a moment. Thalira was watching. When he glanced back, her expression had changed. Not much, just at the edges. Something had shifted. The grip of her jaw had loosened. Her eyes held something new, not trust yet, not even close, but the beginning of the thing that comes before trust. On the fourth day, the fever came. Thalira had seemed stronger the day before, helping to manage the wood supply, moving around the cabin with the careful economy of someone conserving energy. Then, in the early grey light of dawn, Eren woke to Thrawn tugging on his sleeve. The child was doing something with his face, a specific pressed lip expression that needed no translation. Eren crossed the cabin in 3 strides. Thalira was lying on her side, the bearskin thrown back despite the cold. Her skin, normally that vivid green, had gone dull and yellowish at the temples. When he put his hand to her forehead, the heat hit him like opening an oven. High fever. Too high. He had no medicine. His kit was built for wounds and fractures, not fever. A needle and thread, a roll of linen, a tin of rendered fat for burns. Nothing for this. The cause was not hard to understand. She had spent too many hours exposed in the open before he found her, soaked through, her body heat stripped away slowly over what must have been most of a day. The cold had done its damage quietly, the way it always did, and now her body was fighting back hard and late. He did what he could. He melted snow until he had a full pot of clean water, then soaked strips of linen and folded them against her forehead and the back of her neck. He made her drink water in small amounts whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. He kept the stove at a steady medium heat, warm enough to fight the chill, not so hot the cabin air dried out completely. Thrawn sat beside his mother and held her hand and did not make a sound. Eren watched the child's face and felt something move through him that he had no name for. It was heavier than sympathy and more specific than duty. He had spent 11 years telling himself the work was the point, the route, the load, the garrison that needed supplies. He had made himself into a machine for the work and had not thought much about what the machine was for. The boy's hand around his mother's hand made a case that the machine had been missing the point. Through the afternoon and evening, Thalira drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she spoke, guttural words that Eren could not follow, her eyes fixed on something he could not see. Once she said a word several times in a row. A name, he thought, by the way she said it. sharp and grieving at once. He did not ask who it belonged to. He already knew what it meant to call out a name like that. He stayed awake the full night. He had done this before with injured scouts, but never with someone this far outside everything he knew. He changed the cloths. He kept the water warm. He listened to her breathing with the focused attention of a man deciding whether the next sound would be better or worse. Sometime after midnight, Throne fell asleep, still holding her hand. He tipped sideways and curled against her arm, breathing steadily. Eren looked at them in the firelight and thought about what he would do if the fever did not break. He did not let himself finish the thought. Instead, he added a log to the stove, straightened the linen on her forehead and waited. By early morning the fever broke. He felt it in the cloths. They went from scalding to merely warm in the space of an hour. Her breathing deepened and slowed. The yellow tinge at her temples faded back toward green. He let out a breath he had been holding, it seemed, for most of the night. She would live. She woke in the morning to find him asleep against the far wall, sitting upright, chin on his chest. Thrawn was tucked under his arm, both of them still. The stove was still burning. He had kept it fed even through the night, she realized. The water pot beside her was full and still faintly warm. Thalaira lay still and looked at the ceiling of the ruined cabin for a long moment. She had grown up with a very specific picture of what humans were. She had seen it confirmed enough times not to question it, in the stories of the elders, in the burned edges of her clan's territory, in the face of her companion when he came home from the iron borders with wounds that healed crooked. Humans were ambition wearing a face. They took what they wanted and called it civilization. She looked at the man sleeping across the room. He had given her his coat before himself. He had fed her child before eating. He had stayed awake all night to keep her alive while she was helpless, when she could not have stopped him from doing anything he chose. And in the morning, there he was, asleep sitting up, still wearing his work clothes, with her son tucked under his arm like something worth protecting. She sat up slowly. Her body ached deeply, the way it did after fever, every joint a small complaint, every breath costing something, but her head was clear. She reached out and touched her son's face. He stirred, opened his eyes, saw her looking, and made a sound of pure relief that cracked something open in her chest. Eren woke when the boy moved. He blinked, oriented himself quickly the way soldiers do, and looked at her. She read the question in his eyes immediately. "How do you feel?" and touched her own chest, and gave a small nod. He nodded back. Then he stood, crossed to the stove, and began making the morning porridge without a word. They ate in their usual arrangement, child first, then her, then him standing. She watched him eat from his cupped hands and felt the weight of a debt she did not know how to repay in any currency she carried. She said the word she had learned in years of border trading, not the trader's word, but the other one. The one that meant more. Gratitude, she said carefully. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something guttural, an orc word she knew, one of the few that had crossed the border in both directions through long years of uneasy contact, the word for honor, given and received, the word that meant the debt is shared, not owed. She had not expected him to know it. She looked at him differently after that, not with warmth yet. Warmth would take longer. And she was not a woman who gave it easily, but with the specific, clear-eyed regard she had for things that turned out to be something other than what she had assumed. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, Throne picked up his wooden horse and made it gallop across the floor, then set the carved wolf beside it. And for a moment the cabin felt less like a trap and more like a room where people were simply alive together, waiting for the weather to change. On the 8th day, the sky cleared. Eren stood in the doorway and looked out at a world that had been remade overnight. The snow was deep and unmarked, pale gold in the early light, stretching between the dark pine trunks in every direction. The air was cold and perfectly still, no wind, no clouds, a travelling day if he had ever seen one. He turned back into the cabin. Thalira was already watching him. She had been awake before him. He had noticed that she usually was, a habit of someone who had learned that mornings could change fast. She was rebraiding a section of her hair with quick, certain fingers, bone beads clicking softly. Thrawn was still asleep. He told her with his hands, pointed to the sky, made a walking motion, raised his eyebrows in a question. She understood immediately. She nodded. Then she pointed north, traced a line in the air, her direction, her destination. He already knew it could not be close. She had been travelling alone with a child through a blizzard. Whatever place she was going, she had been desperate to get there. He thought about it for perhaps 30 seconds, then he began to pack. She watched him with that careful attention she gave everything, and when he took out his 2 extra strips of leather cord and began weaving them together into a rough snowshoe form, she came and sat across from him and helped without being asked. Her hands were faster than his. She knew this technique, had been doing it longer, and she modified his design without comment, making it stronger. He watched and learned and did not take offense. Thrawn woke while they were finishing and immediately came to sit between them, watching both pairs of hands working. He kept pointing at things and asking his mother questions in a low voice, and she would answer briefly without stopping her work. Once, he pointed at Erron's hands and asked something. Thalira was quiet for a moment. Then she said a single word back. Erron did not know the word. But from the way Thrawn looked at him after, with the open, uncomplicated acceptance that children move into when an adult has been explained to their satisfaction, he thought it might have been something close to safe. They left at mid-morning, after a small meal of the last of the bread. Rust carried both Thalira and Thrawn. Erron walked ahead, breaking trail through the deep snow, using a pine branch as a staff. It was hard work, the kind that fills the lungs and empties the head, and he found he did not mind it. He had walked hard ground before. He would again. The forest was completely silent in the way it only is after heavy snow, every branch holding its white weight, every sound absorbed before it could travel far. Erron felt it settle over him like something close to peace. He did not know what waited at the end of this walk. He had thought about it the night before and decided it did not matter. He had started something. He would finish it. They moved through the white forest in single file, 3 mismatched shapes making new tracks through unmarked ground, the only living things in a mile of silence. Behind them, the trapper's cabin disappeared between the trees. Ahead, the snow stretched on, and somewhere in it, invisible and waiting, the world they were walking toward. The warriors came out of the trees like shadows given shape. 3 of them, mounted on the heavy, shaggy wolves the northern orc clans bred for exactly this terrain. Animals built for deep snow, with thick pelts and paws like plates. The riders wore iron-reinforced leathers and carried axes, with heads the colour of old storm clouds. Their faces were the deep, rich green of old forest. And they moved with the precise economy of people who had been trained since childhood to be dangerous. Erron stopped. He raised both hands, slowly, making them visible. The bow across his back was not drawn. The pistol at his hip was not touched. He stood in the snow with his hands in the air and held very still and let them look at him. The lead warrior, a male with a long scar cutting from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, said something short and hard, not a question. Erron did not understand the words. He understood the tone. Then Thalira slid from Rust's back. She moved fast for someone still recovering, fast and certain, putting herself between Erron and the 3 riders in a single motion. She began speaking, and the guttural roll of the language filled the clearing. Erron watched the warriors' faces while she spoke. The lead warrior's eyes moved from Thalira to Erron to Thrawn, still on the horse, watching everything with the calm attention of a child who has learned not to panic. When his eyes came back to Thalira, The hardness in them had not gone away entirely, but it had shifted, moved back from the edge. She spoke for a long time. She spoke with her hands as well as her words, demonstrating, showing the snowshoes, pointing back the way they had come, touching the fur still wrapped around Thron. At one point, she said something and touched her own chest at the spot where a fever burns. Aaron watched the scarred warrior's face during that moment. Something happened in it, not softness exactly. It was not a face built for softness, but a recalibration, the kind a person does when the story they had already written turns out to be wrong. The warrior looked at Aaron for a long time. Aaron looked back. He kept his hands visible. He kept his breathing steady. He did not look away. The warrior said a single word. Thalira answered it. The warrior was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he dismounted, which in this context was the opposite of an aggressive move. He walked forward through the snow and stopped 2 paces from Aaron and looked at him with an expression Aaron had only seen before in men who had come through something hard and were deciding what to call a stranger who had come through it alongside them. He raised his right fist and pressed it to the center of his chest. Then he lowered his chin. Aaron did not know the formal meaning of the gesture. He did not need to. Some things cross every border. He raised his own right fist and pressed it to his chest and lowered his chin. The warrior's mouth moved, almost briefly, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Then he turned and spoke to the other riders, and they reformed. This time not blocking the path but flanking it, an escort, not a threat. Throne reached down from Rust's back and tugged on the warrior's sleeve. The warrior looked up, surprised. The boy held out the small carved wolf, the one Aaron had made for him in the cabin, and pressed it into the warrior's hand. The warrior looked at it for a moment. He turned it over carefully, the way people handle things that are small and mean more than they should. Then he closed his fingers around it and said something quiet to the boy. Thalira turned to Aaron. She looked at him for a moment, and in that look he read something it would have taken another person a paragraph to say. He nodded. They walked on. The clan's camp sat in a shallow valley where 2 ridges met and broke the wind, a place chosen for exactly the reasons a frontier scout would have chosen it, Aaron thought. Good ground, defensible. The smoke from a dozen fires rose straight up in the still air and spread flat at the treetops, invisible from any distance. Smart. He walked into it with Thalira at his side and Throne on Rust's back, and the camp stopped. Not all at once. It was more like a wave moving through water, one person seeing them, then the next, until the whole settlement had gone quiet and turned toward the entrance. Children ran to their mothers, elders came out of tents, warriors appeared at the edges of the firelight. Thalira spoke before anyone else could. Her voice carried easily across the camp. She spoke for a long time, and while she spoke, Aaron stood still and let them look at him, and did not fidget and did not reach for anything at his belt. He had been watched by hostile eyes before. He had learned that stillness was the only thing worth offering in those moments. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted just long enough to be noticeable. Then the camp's elder, a male whose age had written itself into every line of his face, who carried a carved staff and walked with the deliberate care of someone whose joints had earned their complaints, made his way through the crowd. He stopped in front of Aaron and looked at him for a long time. The dark eyes were sharp, old, weighing. Then he spoke to someone at his side who translated, "You returned my heart to me." Aaron understood what that meant. He had heard the phrase before, at the very edge of the frontier, from traders who crossed in both directions. It meant, you brought back the thing that would have left with them if they had died. He did not know what to say to that. He said, it was cold. Anyone would have. The translator relayed this. The elder looked at him for a moment, then made a sound, a short, dry sound, and said something else. The translator said, he says no, not anyone. Nashoba, for that was the elder's name, Aaron would learn it later, gave him a place at the great fire that night. He ate from the communal pot for the first time in his life, a dense stew of tuber and dried meat that tasted like nothing he had eaten before and was very good. He sat between Thaliara and a warrior who had fought against human soldiers for 20 years, and who, after studying Eron for the length of one meal, offered him a cup of something fermented from mountain berries and said a word that needed no translation. Thron fell asleep against his arm before the evening was half over. He stayed with the clan through the deep winter weeks. He taught them the joinery techniques that kept his garrison buildings from warping in the cold. And they showed him the tracking method that followed elk through unmarked snow and found them every time. He learned 50 words of their language, and they learned 20 of his, and in the gaps between, they communicated with the older language of shared effort and meals eaten together. Rust was given a place in the clan's animal shelter, bedded on dry straw between two of the great wolves. She adapted to this arrangement with the same stubborn practicality she brought to everything, and within a week the wolves had stopped watching her with suspicion and started simply ignoring her, which in that company was the highest form of acceptance. Between him and Thaliara, something grew that had no urgency in it, no drama, no declarations, just proximity and time. And the specific closeness of people who have survived something together and found each other still standing on the other side. Thron called him a name that translated roughly as Mountain Uncle. In spring, when the river Tescan thawed and the valley filled with the sound of meltwater, he and Thaliara were joined under the open sky, the whole clan gathered around them, the ceremony older than any wall ever built between their peoples. He wore borrowed leathers with bone beads along the seam. She wore her own, newly mended, with a strip of human-made linen at the cuff, her choice, her addition. He promised to protect what mattered to her. She promised to be the shield at his back. A year after that, they went back to the pine tree together. Thaliara carried a small girl in a wrap at her chest. They had named her Snow, Neve in the Orc tongue, for the storm that had made everything possible. Thron walked beside them, tall enough now to need a real walking stick and proud of it. Rust walked behind them all, unhurried, her old breath clouding in the mountain air. The tree was still there, old, enormous. The cabin beyond it was further collapsed, the roof half sunken, but the stove chimney still stood. Eron stood at the base of the tree and looked at where they had been, two shapes of green against white, the faint sound of a child crying in the blizzard. And understood, not for the first time, but more completely than before, that the worst day of his life had simply been the door to everything that came after. Thaliara leaned against his shoulder without speaking. Snow slept in her wrap, breathing slowly. Thron stood at the tree's base and pressed his palm flat against the bark, the way the clan elders touched things they wanted to remember. The valley below the Iron Peaks was green now, running with water, full of the noise of the world waking up. The borders were still there, the walls were still there, none of that had changed. But 3 people, and 1 stubborn mule, stood at a pine tree in the mountains, and the cold had no power over them at all.